This podcast is brought to you from our friends at TenCate Protective Fabrics, Emergency Networking, MagneGrip, and IFSTA.
Taking It to the Streets is all about advancing firefighter safety and operational integrity for the fire service through provocative insights and dynamic discussions dedicated to both the art and science of firefighting and the traditions of the fire service. The focus at Taking It to the Street continues to be straightforward, street-level talk with intelligent, stimulating, and provocative insights and dynamic discussion with interactive dialogue and, most importantly, listener participation. Just like around the kitchen table or in the day room over a cup of coffee at 02:30 after a good run. And now, the latest edition of Taking It to the Streets with your host, Christopher Naum.
Welcome to this edition of Buildings on Fires, Taking It to the Streets. I'm your host, Chris Naum, on your street, in your town, around the corner, in your backyard. Again, as we always talk about, Buildings on Fire and Taking It to the Streets is really all about continuing the conversation, talking about our built environment, and more importantly, talking about the influence of our built environment on our first arriving, how construction, tactics, and safety all cohesively come together. So we often talk about, being on your street, in your city, across the country, and around the world. And here we are again talking about some things that are near and dear to us. Many of you, again, continue to follow our programming. We've had the good fortune here through the efforts at fireengineering.com to expand our offerings and the availability of this program, not only in terms of being a podcast, but also now to be able to be simulcasting our program as a webcast presentation. So it's good to be in front of everyone. For those of you that are listening in, again, thank you very much. For those of you that are new to our program, welcome. And to our loyal listeners out there, again, we certainly thank you for your loyal following. Not only on our program, but certainly on all of the other great programming that is available here on fireengineering.com and Blog Talk Radio. So again, on our episode here on Buildings on Fire, Taking to the Streets, we're going to talk about something very succinct, and it aligns with some of the things that we've currently been doing over the course of the last number of months, and have actually been doing for the last 12 to 15 years now. And again, it's primarily just getting out into the streets and looking at our buildings, understanding the importance of how building reads, the size up component of buildings, and how we've got to really develop that skill set level when we talk about assessing, evaluating, sizing up, looking at things that are beyond the obvious upon our first arrival, all the way through the continuum of passing that first arriving actions and first arriving observations and influence what we end up doing on the fire ground, and how command, once they assume command of that incident, if we're passing it over from a company standpoint, or if we're retaining it. But obviously when we have both initial company level size up, determination of actions at the tactical level, and what normally is the formal process of command establishment and the transfer of initial command to sustainable command, there are some unique differences that occur at that particular standpoint. When we talk about some of the criticality of operations, especially on the first due, predicting adverse fire behavior and the potential for structural collapse or compromise is certainly one of the most challenging tasks facing first due companies and commanders at a fire scene. Usually the lack of information on the construction of the building, the fire size, fire location, the fire burn time, the conditions of the building, the fuel load, all of these, along with many other variables, make the task nearly impossible. However, key building considerations and fireground indicators, when presented, when recognized, and when understood and recognized for their relevancy and the importance of the operations, can certainly dramatically change and influence fireground decision making. We often talk about how buildings truly influence decision making on the fireground, both the building and the fire conditions, and certainly those aspects of our company. One of the consistent conversations we have in many of our programming both in terms of our topical areas as well as even some of the dialogue and discussions that come about in those standpoints, have always dealt with three common denominators. And those three common denominators are inclusive of the building, the compartment, and the company. Understanding the aspects of the building, both those subtle as well as those clearly defining aspects of the building's characteristics, are always the challenges in terms of identifying the obvious and then looking beyond the obvious to identify those subtleties that may very well have significant influence on fireground decision making. The second element deals obviously with the fire conditions that are typically found within a compartment. Those compartment fire conditions very well may affect the structure, turn into and evolve into a structural fire condition, and then ultimately how we, as the responding resources, the company, end up engaging and operating on the fireground. Typically, when we talk about first due company operations that are part of our size up conversation here on this episode, again, the first due company, it's the single or the company is either the single or part of that tactical alarm box. It's the first opportunity to put eyes on the building and on the evolving incident. It helps define the priorities, establish and set the actions and the direction, establishes and or passes command during the onset of that incident. It also influences command decision making at so many different levels of that operation. There are critical time and performance influencers that come about as a result of both the simplicity or the complexity of that building, all of which require tactical discipline, and then also influence both the tactical agility and tactical mobility based upon the size, the footprint of the building, both the vertical and horizontal configuration of that particular structure, and again, whatever that occupancy usage, as well as the occupancy type and the occupancy risk. There are six predominant risks when we associate that with our operations, and as we talk further about the size up component, and that deals with building structural integrity, component fire behavior, the availability and the sustainability of water as a significant resource that's going to influence how far we can engage within that building, what is going to be the time elements that are going to influence our operation as far as our tactical windows. But a lot of what we initiate with the availability of tank water or the availability of sustainable water regarding hydrogen or other deliverable water sources. So there's certainly three different elements to that. But at the end of the day, it's all about sustainability in terms of water and the deliverability of that in terms of getting that water into the appropriate compartment areas to initiate actions regarding fire stabilization and incident stabilization based upon, again, resources, and also based upon the severity, the urgency, and the growth, and then more importantly, the availability of time when we talk about tactical windows. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about tactical windows in our other episodes, in previous episodes that you can go back through and go and identify those in the archived programs, again, in fireengineering.com within the podcast programs. The other influencing and stressors that relate back to risk on the first due include compartment, building, structure, fire conditions. So again, we talk about the compartment to the building to the structure fire relationships. It's the compartment to the building to fire behavior. It is both the compartment and the building resiliency and integrity. It is understanding the predictability of the building's performance, which goes back into the POP acronym that we've used and continue to talk about in terms of predictability. And again, predictability as it relates to size up is critical because we don't necessarily have to continue to size up every single aspect of the building. We'll talk about the 5 and 5 here again to reinforce those concepts. But again, it's understanding the anatomy of the building. It's understanding the human performance aspects in terms of our company. And it's actually the RIT component of all three. When we talk about RIT, it is not associated with saving our own, but it is associated when we talk about resiliency, integrity, and the time factors regarding the anatomy of the building, meaning the structural aspects of the structure, how that building is built, the anatomy, the performance characteristics, and it's also the resiliency, integrity, and time of our company in terms of how that resource engage, how it moves through the structure, what is the resiliency based upon the impact of the fire conditions, what is the integrity of that company to maintain the integrity as a unit to move forward based upon the adverse conditions, and again, what is the time elapsement in terms of how do we operate on the fire ground. In other words, we can have a company that's highly effective that has a different elapsed time of being able to conduct and carry out a particular mission and a particular task, or we may have a company that may have significant challenges that may require additional elapsed time. So resiliency, integrity, and time is a direct correlation and a direct relationship back to how that company is comprised, what is the capability of that company, and how can they execute the mission over time.
Seconds count when responding to an emergency. Minutes saved count when documenting your day. Emergency Networking makes records management easier and faster with its fire and EMS solution. User-friendly, complete online and offline functionality, highly customizable, all at an affordable price. For more information, please visit emergencynetworking.com.
It's also understanding the building intel. What kind of information do we have for that building pre-incident, upon arrival, or during the conduct and course of operations? So it is pre-incident intelligence and information. It's also information gathering during the size-up process that we are looking to obtain, and how do we interpret that information, and how do we apply that regarding our fire ground operations, all of which is going to be under the strenuous and influencing aspects of elapsed time. And that goes back to our conversations. We talk about tactical windows. And again, tactical windows primarily are defined as that operational period upon arrival. And normally, best practices talk about that, or when we relate that back to the tactical windows, it's typically 10 minutes or so elapsed time. Sometimes that can expand for the 10 to 15 minute window. Many in the fire service continue to utilize a 20-minute tactical window, which unfortunately is still very antiquated, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But if you're using the 20-minute window, or number one, if you're not using any window whatsoever, that certainly needs to be looked at, and I would highly suggest you to reach out, whether it be to ourselves or other colleagues within your system, within your region, to identify why is it that you're currently utilizing a 20-minute rule on today's fire ground. 10-minute elapsed time is best practice, but again, it's that 10 to 15-minute window in which we need to be monitoring conditions and being able to react to those conditions that are either obvious, that are precursors to an initiating event, or again, may be in the aspect of what may be occurring in the next sequence of time. In other words, we do a pretty good job of reacting to those conditions once adverse conditions occur. In other words, a bad thing ends up occurring, we react to them pretty quickly. Mayday, mayday! We got a flash over, we got a backdraft, or a collapse. We react to those conditions with a degree of promptness, but it again, unfortunately, is in a reactionary manner. So again, the challenge really on for today's incident commanders and operating companies on the modern fire ground is clearly recognize building performance factors and inherent construction characteristics that are fundamental to the manner in which the building's anatomy, meaning the structural conditions of that building, give us our building, and the fire conditions that are present within the building. So when they do present themselves at an evolving incident, it's our ability to ascertain and distinguish how that building will subsequently perform during fire duress, during the continuing fire impingement, fire travel, fire exposure, the degradation of the building, how that building continues to be impacted by heat, flame impingement, flame contact, degradation, and so forth, how that is going to affect the building that, again, is being affected by physics, by fire dynamics during the elapse of time. So how can we identify those particular aspects? And again, are the risks clearly understood? Do we recognize the big picture of those particular elements? And unfortunately, we don't. Part of this whole conversation here today revolves around, are we having the conversations at curbside, post Post-incident, are we having a quick conversation of what the incident gave us in terms of challenges? How did we address those challenges, the severity, the urgency, and growth? Did we meet the mission objectives based upon the tactical operations, the severity, urgency? Did we do a good job, or did we have some challenges, or are there areas of improvement? So curb or street side conversations, both post-incident as well as pre-incident. Again, are you coming back from an alarm? Is there something that you as the company officer are seeing? Is it something that you that are riding backwards in the cab are seeing? And are you saying, hey, Cap, stop here. There's something we have an opportunity to converse about? Or if that opportunity doesn't arise, do you go back to quarters and make a mental note? Do you converse back with the bosses and say, hey, look, we passed a particular thing here. Here's what I saw. Is there some value there that we can go back to at some point, some downtime on the shift, or coming back from another alarm, to identify some conversations that lead to some insights, that lead to lessons, learnings, and hopefully maybe be able to provide some insights that'll help you on the next run, next job that you may have at that address, or something that continues the conversation forward.
IFSTA is dedicated to updating firefighting techniques and safety through the creation of our manuals, apps, curriculum, Resource One, and more. Our high-quality, technically accurate, and affordable training and education materials have made us a worldwide leader of the fire service. Visit us at IFSTA.org for more information.
Are there kitchen table conversations that are occurring? And more importantly, are you taking advantage of getting out into the streets and doing walking tours? One of our signature programs that we've been very proud to bring forward into the North America Fire Service was the conceiving of this idea of taking the classroom out into the streets and making that an extension of what we start in the classroom, and how important street level conversations, street level learnings and insights come about, and really getting out into the streets, reading your buildings, and gaining that level of insights. One of the first programs that we initiated over 13 years ago was the first reading the buildings, street walking tours that are now sort of coming about to be somewhat common. There are certainly many others that I think have recognized the value of taking companies out into the streets and sizing up and looking at buildings. So the concept of street size up is nothing new, but the concept of doing a formal type of programmatic classroom educational opportunity that has structure, that has specific targeted insights, is new to the fire service. And again, we had initiated these types of street learnings all the way back in the early 2000s, and then actually formalized this concept of reading the buildings, walking tours, walking lecture tours, a variety of different terminology. But we were the first to bring that forward into the fire service, and we're the first to bring that into a conference type setting and opportunity that became a very signature program at that particular venue, and it continues to be part of our signature series. So our walking street tours, many of you again are familiar with what Chief Danny Sheraton and I have been doing in New York City. We sort of have a signature walking tour that takes place in New York City. We try to schedule out at least one or two of these things on an annual basis. We started off with this pre-COVID. COVID hit and we had some setbacks, but again, we've sort of brought that forward over the last 18 months in particular. We did have a program earlier this year that consists of a formal walking tour beginning in Midtown Manhattan and ending in Lower Manhattan, and really having the opportunity to go down the formal street side, curbsides, the back way, the alleyways, and look at a variety of different buildings, both occupancy type, occupancy risk, different eras and vintage of buildings, and talk about specifics with our class, and look at it from the perspective of the command level, the company level, the firefighter level. How do we develop skill set levels to assess and evaluate the building at all phases of the operation? But more importantly, how do I develop the skill set level as a first arriving company officer, as a first arriving command officer, of which there are distinctively different or expanded building reads that occur at the company and at the command level. So again, we had the good fortune over the course of over the course of the last couple of weeks, we did a program at Wichita Hot, which is conducted in Wichita, Kansas, by our good friends at the Wichita Fire Department and the Fools of Oz group that again are very prominent in that region of the United States, and certainly within Wichita and the surrounding area of the state of Kansas. We had the opportunity again to work with the fine individuals that were part of that program, but also the numerous colleagues that came from throughout the Midwest, all the way from the North and South Dakotas, from Nebraska, from various other surrounding states. We had a number of individuals that were part of our program and our street tour that came from the Texas area and so forth, as well as throughout Wichita, the metropolitan area, and throughout the states. And again, the whole premise of this is that by taking your companies in a formal or informal manner out into the street settings and looking at your buildings to identify some of those key attributes are really defining in terms of developing exceptional operational skill set capabilities, but also to be able to look at the 1,000-level view that we're all pretty familiar with and really get into that street level view at the curbside, in the alleyways, both within and external to the building, to identify things that we may know, things that we assumed, things that we didn't know until we've gotten into that building.
Like a trusted turnout jacket you've had for years, Flex 7 outer shell fabric delivers a perfectly broken-in feel on the very first wear. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of Enforce technology, Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tencatafabrics.com/flex7. Flex 7, powered by Enforce technology, only from TenCate Protective Fabrics.
And even what was interestingly enough about our recent tour there in Wichita was the amount of insights that even seasoned company and commanding officers that were part of our class. So we spent an entire day. So we started off with a formal pre-briefing in the classroom setting for about an hour and a half, 90 minutes. Then we ventured out into our walking tour in the physical environment, that built environment of Wichita, as an example. And as we commenced this walking tour, one of the things that we keyed in on that was part of our formal presentation was looking at both historical buildings, both new and old, looking at those historical contexts of buildings. We actually focused in on the development of the first taxpayer type structures within Wichita in the very early 1920s, 1930s era, and then how that we took a look at the taxpayers within that area of Wichita that originated back in the 1920s to early 1930s that gave us the first taxpayer type of occupancies that became very common in that region as the 1930s, 40s, and 50s commenced. With that being said, one of the other things that was very unique to that particular area was the vast amount of bowstring profiled types of commercial buildings and the adaptive reuse of those particular structures. So again, in that 1930s, 40s, and 50s vintage, primarily beginning in the mid 1920s, the application of a bowstring type or bowstring profiled roof became necessary based upon the types of occupancy usages in the development and growth of that particular area. But as we got into these particular buildings, what was very notable and noticeable, as I referred back to this, is that when you're at street side and you take a look at a particular profile, or take a look at a particular type of a parapet or a condition with type 3 construction as an example, we make assumptions, and we make an assumption based upon what we are able to see from a particular vantage point, either up closer to the building or from a slight distance away from the structure upon our arrival, upon our access to the building. So what was assumed typically to have been buildings that would have been, upon entry, buildings of heavier timber type of construction and bowstring applications, turns out that there's a much higher degree of buildings of steel component construction that give us a bowstring type of a truss system, along with a varied type of a roof membrane system. So both the roofing diaphragm, meaning the types of joist systems that are incorporated as part of the assembly. So we've got a bowstring configured roof assembly, of which the components of that roof assembly in the bowstring profile are all constructed of metal components, some of which were bolted, some were welded, and some, in a different vintage in time or era in time, were riveted construction, all with a variety of different age and configurations. But it certainly wasn't what one was expecting to find as we got into the building. So we had a great opportunity to get into many structures, take a look at what we assumed the conditions to be from different vantage points, up and around other adjacent structures. And as we got into the size of conversations, we identified features, again, around the perimeter walls, around the parapets, around features of drain or leader conditions and so forth, the drain pipes and such. And prior to entering that structure, there was a consensus of opinion that this particular building was of a particular era and vintage, of a particular type of construction in terms of its classification, and thusly the type of roof construction one could presume to be present without actually getting onto the roof, without initiating any types of curve cuts or observation holes or opening up other aspects of that building. We made these assumptions, and again, based upon the consensus of our class, and then upon entry, lo and behold, we either had validation that this was what they expected it to be, or we had a surprise that the building was something entirely different.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with MagneGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit MagneGrip.com.
And more often than not, the first assumption was heavier timbered components that were part of the assembly that gave us a type of post-tensioned bowstring type of roof system, when in fact we got in there and instead of heavier timbered construction, we end up identifying various types of components that were part of an assembly that gave us a steel framed type of structural system, all of which have different tactical windows. They are affected differently by the flame impingement conditions. So, and in many instances, the occupancy of these particular buildings were places of commercial assembly. In other words, we had high assembly occupancies in these retail, in these types of restaurants or other service-oriented assembly points where we've got a lot of population, or we've got a lot of civilian load in terms of population load to the buildings, and that in itself, coupled with other factors of the building, create a number of cascading challenges associated with that particular structure. So it was just interesting to look at that. One of the things I want to talk a little bit further about that as it relates to size up, and again, I just want to run through this rather quickly. When we talk about size up and assessment and building reads, we've got to be concerned when we talk about the building related to, again, the fire location, thermal assault, the environmental aspects. So it's both the environmental conditions that are affecting the building, it's the thermal assault on the aspects of that building within the compartment, within the building structure itself, and the aspects of fire. We need to recognize that all buildings, again, are going to follow the rules of physics. When we talk about mass, material, and the actions associated with those conditions and the reactions. So physics has a very predominant role in all of this. We need to understand the laws of gravity. We also need to understand how the various aspects of our buildings are affected by both heat, fire, and environmental impact conditions. What can become compromised, what can fall, what can collapse, what can fail. how those conditions may lead to finite conditions, and how they really react under the aspects of the predictability of building performance. The one thing that is true to all of these items is that there are various variables of building RIT. And when we talk about that, again, it goes back to resiliency, integrity, and time. There are variables based upon the era and vintage. There are variables based upon the building's anatomy that are very predictable, that again lead into other considerations. So we need to develop that aspect of building literacy, fire literacy, understanding the building anatomy, understand how that relates back to building compartment and company, understand that there is an acronym. Again, unfortunately, there is, and I'm not going to offer any apologies to that, but the acronym helps define and develop the skill set level. So when we talk about the building's predictability performance, when we talk about era and vintage, it's so important to understand and align that with what we developed this around, again, over 18 years ago, when we developed this concept of how important era and vintage is, and again, how that has really become somewhat institutionalized, because we do find many other instructors, colleagues, we find this concept embedded in a variety of other textbooks and other various types of publications, where the concept of what we introduced in terms of the importance of taking era and vintage, meaning how and when that building was built, as it relates back to architecture and engineering, are so important, as it aligns with first arriving construction tactics and safety. The era of the building and its relationship back to the methods and materials of construction, the manner in which it was being built, and how they relate back to operational considerations has everything to do with developing that level of understanding and developing that particular skill set. So we want to just reinforce a couple of those particular aspects to it. So again, when we talk about the acronym of BEAR, it is the predictability of performance. It is the inherent and intrinsic conditions that are part of that building, things that again are adaptive, both new and old. They all definitely relate back to the types of construction, and that relate back to the NFPA 220 standard, but also recognize, for those of you that have been listening to our programs, is that the NFPA 220 standard in the early 1950s is what gave us our type 1 through 5 construction classifications. Recognize that in the early 1900s, or as late as the late 1800s, moving into the early 1900s, that it wasn't until the National Board of Fire Underwriters gave us our first model building code in 1900. And as it moved forward over the next 10 to 15 years, by 1915, we had a recognized, established, and institutionalized national code that started defining building types and other characteristics within that particular building. But even then, the building type classifications were entirely different. We did not have what, as we are aware of now today, type 1 through 5. We had different type 1 through 3, 1 through 4 classifications, which does not align with anything that we have been using over the last 73 plus years. So it's important to note, we'll leave that for another conversation and discussion, but it has everything to do back with that. And then lastly, just to sort of close the loop on the conversation, when we talk about sizing up, again, there's 5 and 5. We talk about the aspects of 5 critical domains in sizing up our buildings, and those include part of our 5-star command model, and they are inclusive of construction anatomy or construction systems, and the era and vintage. So when we take a look at, we talk about a building of brick and joist construction, or a building of type 2 non-combustible construction, or a mill or semi-mill constructed building, or a building of type 5 wood frame construction. There's different aspects of that building regarding era and vintage. Was it built in the late 1800s? I had fully dimensioned lumber. Was it built in the early 1920s or 1930s? And it was, again, fully dimensioned lumber of a balloon framing type of system used in residential construction? Or am I dealing with, again, let's say the 2000s, dealing with a new version of engineered structural systems, which is far different than lightweight construction that was introduced back as early as the mid 1960s. So it wasn't until the 1980s that the modern era of construction, or the modern era, both the fire service and the modern era of construction, can be associated with it. But it was around the 1980s in which the lightweight construction that was being introduced in the early 1960s really became institutionalized, became very, very common. We started talking about gusset plates, and we talked about galvanized metal plate connectors. We started talking about gable trusses, individual components that were part of our truss systems, the introduction of the parallel core truss, the introduction of the wooden I-beams, and how those have evolved from the early days of lightweight construction in the 80s and 90s to what we commonly refer to engineered structural systems here in the 2000 era. And again, especially over the last 20 years, there have been very distinctive types of eras and vintage. The other thing that we want to be aware of when we're sizing up and evaluating our structures relates back to 5 critical aspects of our building. So the 5 aspects that we started talking about here, again, we talked about construction systems, the era and vintage. It's understanding occupancy type and occupancy risk, as well as occupancy usage and occupancy configurations and profiling. In other words, what's the square foot? What is the occupancy type? What is the occupancy use and risk? What's the occupancy status? What is the occupancy configuration? Is it horizontal? Is it vertical? Is it a low rise? Is it a high rise? Is it something longitudinal in terms of its profiling? Are there aspects of reading the fire ground associated with that building's usages as such? And then also when we talk about those considerations, what's the square footages? What are the cubic footages? How does that relate back to considerations in the profiling? It is the third item of that consideration also includes the collapse and compromise characteristics, of which there are some critical components to that. The fourth item is the methods and the materials of construction that has everything to do with era and vintage. And then the fifth component is the fire dynamics within that building. So that is the 5 fundamentals that are part of our building construction domain, of which there are 5 subsets that one wants to be aware of when we're assessing that building. So of the 5, of all the vastness of things that can affect a building, there are 5 critical considerations that one has to be focusing in on when we talk about our size up. And that includes, so when we talk about reading the fire ground, we talk about reading the building, talk about reading the compartment, talk about reading the company. There are 4 distinctive reads that we've talked about in the past regarding our buildings, of which there are a series of cascading aspects of fire origin that are going to affect these other 5 pieces here that I'm going to make mention of. So let me just quickly give you a quick rundown. When we talk about fires that are both internal or external, there are fires within the compartment, when we talk about room or room and contents. There are fires within the structure that affect both the system, they affect the assembly. There are conditions that are within the concealed spaces and the voids. So I'll give you our rundown and criteria of which they need to be considered, and we seldom talk about these enough. So when we start talking about sizing them up, we talk about those considerations. It is the fire origin, either that's known or predicted, or that's projected based upon, again, putting these parameters together. We have a fire that originates in the compartment that can go to the structure. We can have a fire that originates in the structure that can go to the compartment. We can have external to compartment. We can have external to structure. And these are all going to affect both strategic and tactical considerations. But it gets into this concept even more so when we talk about fires within the structure and fires within the compartment. And this gets into what I consider to be more intermediate to advanced level discussions and conversations that go beyond the cursory size up that we typically get programmed and conditioned to do, but not nearly discussed enough to take us to that next level of literacy that helps influence and fine-tunes our decision-making skill sets that all have everything to do with the building and the compartment. So I'll just give you a quick reiteration of some of those other factors here. And again, we very well may talk about this in greater detail. I think you can look forward to having some additional research and reference information coming forward in the not too distant future that'll expand upon this particular aspect. But again, we talk about fire in the structure, fire in the compartment. There is compartment to structure. There is structure to compartment. So we can have a fire originating on the structure or within the structure that gets into the compartment. So just always consider, again, if I have a completely open, exposed structure, it pretty much goes, the compartment is the structure. So compartment to structure, structure to compartment. It is compartment to compartment. It's compartment to external. So we have auto extension. Compartment fire goes to the external portion of the building. We have compartment to the external. Think of this going from room and contents to external auto extension. It rides the face of the and extends up the face of the structure, gets up into the eave line, now goes back into the structure. So it's compartment to external to structure. It's external to compartment. It's external to structure. It is external to compartment to structure. And then lastly, it is compartment to structure. So each one of these categories, each one of these classifications has both strategic and tactical considerations. They also affect our reads on the fire ground regarding our size up, and they also affect the aspects of the tactical window. So I just wanted to get that out there just for conversation. Again, if this is the first you've heard of this, there are a lot of other things that we can talk about here today. But again, I want to focus in on the influencing factors that we just talked about here. Again, the aspects of BEAR, building, error and vintage, building anatomy, and the aspects of risk. That's what that acronym relates back to. It is the predictability modeling, which relates back to construction systems, the aspects of occupancy and the considerations associated with those. It is the compromise and collapse considerations. It is the methods and materials of construction. And again, that fifth element is the fire dynamics within the structures, of which the critical reads are associated with both the roof systems, the perimeter walls, the floor and or ceiling systems. It is the considerations for the compartment, and it is the considerations for the absence, the presence, and the characteristics of void. So there are 5 mission critical reads that one has to focus in on that may relate to the operations. Again, roof, perimeter walls, floors, and or ceilings, the compartment or compartments, which may be multiple, and then the absence or presence and the locations of those voids. Again, do we have a void within the wall? Do we have a perimeter wall? Do we have a void within the floor systems? Do we have a void that is part of a roof system? What is the size? What is the extentiveness? Are there firewalls, fire separations? Are those separations or other types of rated assemblies, are they compromised? What and what is the extent of those locations, both in terms of volume and square footages? So they are very, very important. If this is the first you've heard of them, they are critical to much of our conversations on the predictability performance of our buildings and have everything to do with building reads. And again, when we take a look at these particular aspects, there are significant challenges. There are risk factors, there are benchmarking considerations, there's the first arriving 360 or 180. We spend a lot of time talking about that in the fire service, whether it be at the strategic or tactical level, but we also recognize that there may be very mission critical impediments. In other words, there may be challenges to be able to conduct a 360 when we're in the middle of the row of a particular structure, and getting into the other end of that street and getting back to the alleyway may be challenging, and there may be a considerable lapse of time. But again, do we implement being able to access an adjacent exposure, go from front to rear, be able to take a look at what's in the rear of that structure, in that exposure building, in the adjacent structure, either above or below the fire floor, in order to again, or get onto that roof, get over to the edge condition of that roof area, take a look at what's behind that or in the rear division of that building, to be able to communicate critical insights and observations. So it's not always that 360, it is that 180 or the 90, or just accessing from front to rear, rear to front, whatever the arrival position puts you in, but just gaining access and observing what's occurring, whether it be from rooftop, whether it be from a vantage point of another window area at an adjacent exposure or another floor area of what's occurring in the rear of the structure. Do I have auto extension? Do I have civilians on fire escapes? Are there individuals that may be present? Do we have the integrity of perimeter enclosure, or do I have a series of windows that are starting to let go, or auto extension? Do I have fire conditions that have gone from compartment to exposure back into the structure? Again, much of what we just talked about here in our conversation. So the other aspects here get back into critical thinking. And again, just as a refresher, again, I'm not going to get into this in great detail here on this program, but the foundations of cognitive skill set levels are so important to size up that whole mental action. We talk about thinking, knowing, remembering, judging, and problem solving. Again, these are the overreaching elements of critical thinking, but probably the most important is being able to remember or to be able to recall. And that recall comes back into what we talked about earlier, getting into the street, having curbside conversations, going out, walking down. Again, we used to talk about, just doing pre-fire plannings and doing walkthroughs of our buildings, but it's so much more than that when we talk about truly learning from the streets, learning within the buildings, learning from what we have the advantage of seeing at curbside, what we may be able to be seeing from roof side, as well as both inside and outside of that structure. There are a number of, when we talk about critical thinking, we talk about probably the most critical core sets of aspects when we talk about the size up. And again, looking at our building, compartment, company, looking at the building, looking at those 5 critical aspects, the 5 critical reads. So when we talk about the mission critical foundation of size up, in the big scheme of things regarding cognitive skill set levels, it is the ability to have these core skill sets that deal with sustained attention, response inhibition, the speed for information processing. So in other words, what is it that we're able to get both verbal as well as visual indicators? How well are we able, or other things that are being communicated that we're listening to, that we are being told to us, how well are we able to process? What is the speed and the accuracy of that information processing? It is the ability to have both cognitive flexibility and control, the ability to have multiple stimulations that are simultaneously hitting us. Again, looking, seeing, hearing, smelling, the yelling and screaming that's coming in one ear while we're listening to the radio mic that with critical communications that are coming in from that standpoint, while we're observing and trying to process these cues and indicators that are all in front of us, and trying to differentiate, prioritize, and be able to react upon those things. And more importantly, be able to recognize some patterns, which leads us into, again, having working memory, having category formation, being able to identify some things, put them into some categories, and then lastly, the aspect of pattern recognition. How do I put these things together, recognizing the patterns of this information? And probably the biggest, when we bend these things together, in my opinion, I think the most critical aspects here of building reads goes back to working memory, goes back to category formation and pattern recognition. And pattern recognition has everything to do with category formation. When we talk about the 5 and 5, what is it that I'm seeing? What is it that I'm trying to recall? What am I being able to start putting together? And the most critical part of this is being able to do this with a degree of speed. In other words, we can eventually get there when we try to put all of these patterns together. It's no different than having, a box of puzzle pieces in front of you. Little by little, you're starting to recognize and identify certain pattern, certain features, and you suddenly start putting those first 2 pieces of that puzzle together. Little by little, over the course of time, depending upon how many pieces that you may have, that pattern recognition becomes very apparent. We start seeing a picture that becomes coming about through these pieces coming together. And sometimes we have pieces that are missing, but eventually when that puzzle is all put together, the patterns have all been formed together, and we now have a clear read of what that particular puzzle might be. So again, correlation is very similar to looking at the building. Sometimes we have a variety of missing pieces, and whether I have a 10-piece puzzle, which now trying to put those patterns together becomes very much more at ease, because we're able to, again, see, make these connections through our cognitive skill set level. But if we don't understand what that picture may be, again, even with 5 or 10 pieces, it may be difficult at best. That goes back into working memory, which is derived from where? Experience on the fire ground, experience in training, putting these things together. So they all become part and parcel with what is constantly referred back to as far as recognition, prime decision making, or naturalistic decision making, that are all part of this aspect. But ultimately, it's all about the pattern recognition, category formation that does what? It goes back to the 5 and 5. How can I simplify the world? How can I simplify the complexities of our building? Well, again, it is the 5 pieces: building anatomy, occupancy, collapse and compromise characteristics, methods and materials that again relate back to era and vintage, and then fire dynamics. And then the other 5 of those, again, deals with roof systems, perimeter walls, floors and or ceilings, the compartment, absence of voids. So I've got 10 pieces, right? 10 and 10. I've got 10 pieces that really form our puzzle that when we are looking at that building, put these things together from that standpoint. So they are, again, it's not a purely linear process. It does require very rapid, accurate, rational, decisive, action-oriented needs in terms of developing that skill set. And when we talk about the evolving built environment, design, construction practices, it has everything to do with our building. When we take a look at fire dynamics, it has everything to do with the compartment, its resiliency, integrity, and time. When we take a look at resources, capabilities, and our personnel, it has everything to do with the company. So now we start correlating back to building, compartment, and company. It's part of the adaptive fireground management model that we have. It has everything to do with our first arriving, construction, tactics, and safety. So ultimately, when we put all of this together, and the things that all of us are striving to develop is how can I more accurately assess and evaluate my buildings upon the arrival, first due arrival. And whether it be at the company or the command level, again, that first arriving, I'm going to look at construction characteristics. I'm going to look at the tactical elements that are derived by construction, and I'm going to manage the incident from a risk standpoint based upon safety. First arriving, construction, tactics, and safety. Those are the facts of our operation. Quickly here, as we start closing out our conversation, I want to give you some insights here that are based upon our original research on where did size up come from. And we did an entire program on this last year in a previous episode, and it may have actually been upwards of 2 years ago. And I think what our intent here was to talk a little bit about these aspects of size up in terms of their origination and utilize this as a stepping stone into next month's conversation of looking at some very, very specific aspects here that we talked about and introduced here about pattern recognition and maybe associated that with whether it be the residential, or one of the things that we are looking to do is talk a bit more about the commercial fire ground. We've had a couple of opportunities here over the last couple of months to do some face-to-face programs specific to the commercial fire ground, commercial occupancies. And one of the things that I've been developing from a program standpoint, production standpoint, is to bring in a couple of other very notable, very recognizable fire service colleagues, both instructors at FDIC, very well known from their, both in terms of their writings as well as their teachings, but a couple of other colleagues of ours, bring them in and have a very specific conversation on 3 aspects dealing with the commercial fire ground, dealing with, again, the size up, and then ultimately the operations of our building. So building construction, actually 3 parts: building construction conversation, size up conversation on the commercial fire ground, and then operational considerations. And that is what we're planning ahead for our next 3 episodes, at least as we're envisioning them right now. So I want to talk a little bit about some size up characteristics. And again, just to go back to the origination. So when we talk about size up, where did it come from? How is it being implemented? And how have we sort of stalled out in our current standpoint here? So the first textbook for the fire service that was published was the Fire Chiefs Handbook by the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and Fred Shepard was the author of that, and that originated and was first published in 1932. It first began its compilation in the mid-1920s. It was recognized by the IAFC Educational Committee in the mid-1920s that there was a need to start putting together some best practices and insights, which eventually became the Fire Chiefs Handbook, which again were the development occurred in 1928, first published, the first textbook for the fire service published in 1932. Within the confines of that handbook were the aspects of saving life. So one often asks, where did we come up with interior firefighting as being best practice? Where did we come up with certain aspects of life safety, property conservation? It was within the IAFC Fire Protection Handbook, first edition, 1932. And it talks about, again, the first duty of the fire department at fires was to save life. So the first whole aspect of life safety was derived out of that book. However, within that book also was a quote, and I'm going to read this quote unquote. The same appraisal of life holds in the case of members of the fire department. So although that textbook, although we have been talking about life safety being first and foremost in all of almost 100 years of time, they also talked and stressed about the importance and the value and the appraisal of life safety for firefighters. And that was very prominently presented in the beginning of that book. And it also talked about the delay of hose lines because of the need to prioritize life safety above all. So it's very interesting. It really gets into a number of different aspects of that. Talked about life safety, property hazard, and property conservation. It was all derived out of that 1932 edition. So it also talked about the initial action plan being based upon the arrival of the first officer. And again, quote unquote, the first officer arrival rests the heaviest responsibility. So first arriving, and within that book, talked about the importance of types of construction, the development of fire, talked about each type of construction having its own characteristics and how they were important. It also derived the first conversation about size up in terms of building height, construction type, the presence and location, the numbers of openings, fire location, occupancy, exposures, both interior and exterior. And guess what? They also talked about the importance of the environmental factors of wind. Again, 1932, over almost 100 years ago, we were talking about wind-driven considerations on today's fireground, on the modern fireground in that era. And here we are going 360, 360, 360 over and over again, and suddenly having wind-driven conditions become part of our conversation here in the early 2000s and continuing to influence our conversations. It also talked about accessibility, resource needs, and they also talked about, and I'll say this quote unquote, scientifically and carefully fought fires, extinguished quickly, confined to the smallest area, directly to the seat of the fire location by interior means when possible. That is the genesis of interior firefighting operations. And also within that textbook, ventilation, or the concept of opening up the building. Opening up the building, that terminology originated in the Fire Chiefs Handbook of 1932. The concept and the term opening up was utilized, and ventilation was promoted. Prior to this, public opinion within the fire service, opening up the building and ventilating the building was considered poor practice. But in 1932, opening up the structure, ventilating, coordination of ventilation, considerations for wind-driven conditions, keeping fire to the smallest area, confining it to the smallest area by internal access and means was the first and foremost part of that. So it's very important to recognize that, and again, coming about in the blue-collar era of 1932. And so rests the importance of both life safety to the civilians and life safety to the fire service. So don't forget about that, and don't undermine the importance of that. 1960, in the second edition of the Fire Chief's Handbook, were some more defining aspects of pre-arrival size up, some aspects of building considerations, and more considerations about the fire in terms of the extent, the location, the type of construction, life safety hazards, both in terms of the occupant and the aspects of the firefighters, fire conditions, the needs and the effect of fire on the building and on the material. It's, I think, important to note that, again, in 1953, Lloyd Lehman talked about the 5 critical steps of size up and really was the father of size up conversation, talking about facts, probability, our own situation, decision making, whether we go into a mode of attack, tactical decisions, and then also the plan of operations, or to develop a plan of attack to mitigate the incident. So the size up, as it was developing in the early 1950s, much of this was attributed back to Chief Lloyd Lehman in his book on the attack and extinguishment of interior fires and fireground operations. Firefighting strategy in the 1960s, primarily from the 60s and 70s, both from Charles Walsh, who was FDNY, and William Clark, again, also FDNY, talking about size up and the pertinent 15 points of locating the extent of fire, life hazard, time, exposure, building systems, water supply, street conditions, resources, construction type, occupancy, weather, height, areas, and other misleading aspects. It's interesting to note that in Williams Clark, Firefighting Principles and Practices in 1974, Clark wrote about and was highly influenced by the Fire Chief's Handbook of 1932. But Clark also discussed action plans and was the first to make reference back to the Iowa formula. He was also the first to talk about reading smoke. He was the first to actually coin that term, reading smoke, and also how will fire both spread within the building, and then also talked about the aspects and the importance of having a safety officer. But in the preface of the 1974 edition of Firefighting Principles and Practices, Clark also makes reference back to the fact that the 14 and or 15 points of size up, as described by Chief Walsh in 1963, actually went back all the way to FDNY, at least into 1939. And although the actual genesis of where that came about, the FDNY was talking about these 15 or 14 points of size up as early as somewhere in the 1939 era of time, which went on to be part and parcel to what John Norman referred to as coal was wealth, that acronym, in 1991. So we can see that there is a genesis of all of these particular aspects. Warren Kimball in 1966, 1968, Fire Attack 1 and 2, very vintage, influential books, talked about size up being done by the first due company, and then also size up being done by the first arriving chief and chief's aide. So in 1966 and 1968, Fire Attack 1 and Fire Attack 2, and then what went on to be the next editions in 68, Fire Attack 1 and then Fire Attack 2, both the numeral 1 and the numeral 2 came about. And then also within those particular textbooks, there were more defining aspects of gallon per minute flow rates based upon the occupancy, square footages, and volumes, and so forth. So there was also a lot of conversations getting into that particular considerations. I think that one of the defining books of developing size up as a pertinent element, and again, occurred in 1972 with Emanuel Fried's Fireground Tactics. And again, Fried talks about these defining aspects, again, influenced by FDNY, coming out of FDNY as a fire chief, but also the influencing aspects of that 1939 era, the 1932 vintage of the Fire Chief's Handbook, and so forth, that leads us up forward into Coal Was Wealth by Chief John Norman, who again is very classical. I think this has become more of the institutionalized aspect. Many of us in the fire service, and it's interesting that again, although if you were brought up in the 90s and early 2000s, and again, you utilize the acronym of COLE as well, if you pretty much understood the acronym of occupancies, area potentials, life, water supply, apparatus personnel, preconditions, weather, exposure, auxiliary appliances, location, the extent of fire, time, and hazards associated with it. But again, whether it be the cheat sheet that one would pick and utilize off of the apparatus dashboard, or the things that we kept underneath our helmets, they were very much part and parcel to how we developed our size up skill set levels coming out of Brunici's Fireground Commander series in the 1980s, mid 1980s, to what became sort of the institutionalized aspects of First Do Size Up through John Norman's textbook and handbook for today's fire officers. So there's a variety of other aspects here that we're not going to get into based on some time limitations, but there's some different acronyms. There's some different things that are coming out of Blue Card order model of size up, of both structure size up, building size up, and so forth. But and again, there's the unsighted ABCD, which deals with address, building description, conditions, deployment directives, just quick and dirty. And then there's also, and again, we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the slicer aspects of what have come into that particular element. One of the things that we are going to talk more about in our future episodes is tying back into something that we've been utilizing for quite a number of years now, and that is the OTA loop. And the OTA loop as part of our tactical deployment modeling for tactical windows. And that was developed, again, by Colonel John Boyd back in the late 1950s. It has seen a somewhat resurrection in recent, certainly in the last year, by a few individuals who sort of, I think, rediscovered Colonel Boyd's conversations with what the OTA loop means. We talk about observe, orient, decide, and act, and how that is so mission critical when we talk about cues, patterns, and connections, and it is a looping process, and we've tied that into our conversations on our tactical windows, and something we've been talking about for well over 10 years, but it's just recent to see again how that has come back and percolated back up to the mainstream in terms of both articles, conversations, and actually seeing that into the lecture circuits and talking about how the OTA loop, the OODA, orient, observe, observe, orient, decide, and act, and how they become so critical to, again, pattern recognitions, cue indicators that are all part of our first arriving construction tactics and safety. So we're going to get into more of these conversations about how they relate back into our size up skills of, again, reading the fireground, reading the building, reading the compartment, and reading the company. The four predominant primary reads on the fireground that relate back to building, compartment, and company, that relate back to, again, building anatomy, occupancy characteristics, collapse and compromise size up, the methods and materials of construction, fire dynamics that are all influenced by the era and vintage of that particular building, of which the critical reads are inclusive of, again, roof, perimeter walls, floor and or ceilings, compartment, and the identification and absence of voids. Those are part of our conversation. So we've talked about a number of these different variables. The other thing that I will leave you as a sort of an assignment for nothing else, if you have not had the opportunity to read into or are not aware of the NFPA 1700 guide, I would encourage you to take a look at that online on the nfpa.org site. Also take a look at the correlations, because much of what we talk about revolve around both NFPA 1710, 1720, NFPA 1500, and 1561, and now inclusive of NFPA 1700 as a guide. They have everything to do with today's modern fireground, talking about first arriving construction tactics and safety, and those influencers that all revolve around the predictability of the building and its performance, and the aspects of fire dynamics that affect both strategic considerations and tactical operations. So we will continue to delve into these particular conversations, get into the aspects of those, and I think, again, for what our plans are, and again, that may change, but at least going forward here with our upcoming conversations for our other upcoming episodes, we will be switching over to and talking about some things dealing with the commercial fireground, again, both in terms of hybrid as well as other types of construction. We are going to focus in on a particular building footprint, predominantly the 30,000 square foot or less footprint building when we talk about fire ground reads, but we'll talk about building construction. We will talk about occupancy risks and occupancy types. We'll talk about the reads associated with that building, and we'll talk about operational concerns along with some new guest speakers that we'll bring into our program here. And those are our plans for the upcoming 2 to 3 episodes here on Buildings on Fire, taking it to the streets. So as we wrap up on this episode, again, we've talked about a number of things, reinforced some aspects. I do encourage you to go back into the archives, take a look at many of our other exceptional programs throughout many years, going back a number of years on Fire Engineering's Blog Talk Radio that are archived out. Take a look at many of the other exceptional programs that are available to you on Fire Engineering's archive programs of both webinar and podcast and webcast-based programming that all dovetail together. We are all trying to connect these dots here to talk about some very critical elements here to understand the challenges of today's modern fireground, but also understand the continuing challenges of the built environment. So again, our program focuses in on the built environment and those related issues, of which there's such a wealth. We'll talk about era and vintage. So a lot of different things to talk about here. Look forward to seeing many of you in the streets with some upcoming programs coming about. We're doing a street read on a regional training program down in Florida that for those of you that are listening to the program live will be coming up in a couple of weeks. We do look forward to, whether it be at the regional level, that all built up to and help support the exceptional opportunities that are afforded to all of us at FDIC. And again, FDIC is going to be right around the corner here as we move into 2024. Each and every year on an annual basis in the early part of the year, typically in the April timeframe, we have the opportunity to convene and have some exceptional training program opportunities, both the hands-on hot programs as well as the classroom. We have the good fortune to be able to do a pre-conference program, which will be a 4-hour topical program on some critical aspects here that we continue to talk about here on our program on Buildings on Fire, taking the streets. So again, keep an eye out for those announcements coming about here in the not too distant future, and we really look forward to having you sit in our classroom if you are taking advantage of being present at FDIC. We'd love to have you in our classroom, sitting in the streets, or having a conversation in the hallways outside of the classroom settings, both formal and informal. So until next time, companies are in quarters and off the air. Stay safe, but keep in mind there's a job being worked somewhere in the streets in your city, across the country, and around the world, doing what we do best and being who we are, and that's firefighters. So take care, everyone. And that closes out this edition of Taking to Your Streets. I'm your host, Chris Naum. Stay safe and be both building and be fire literate. Keep on learning. Have those street side conversations. Get into your buildings. See you next time on the next edition of Buildings on Fire, Taking to the Streets.
Seconds count when responding to an emergency. Minutes save count when documenting your day. Emergency networking makes records management easier and faster with its fire and EMS solution. User-friendly, complete online and offline functionality, highly customizable, all at an affordable price. For more information, please visit emergencynetworking.com.
IFSTA is dedicated to updating firefighting techniques and safety through the creation of our manuals, apps, curriculum, Resource One, and more. Our high-quality, technically accurate, and affordable training and education materials have made us a worldwide leader of the fire service. Visit us at IFSTA.org for more information.
Like a trusted turnout jacket you've had for years, Flex 7 outer shell fabric delivers a perfectly broken-in feel on the very first wear. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology, Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tencatafabrics.com/flex7. Flex 7, powered by enforced technology. Only from TenCate Protective Fabrics.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with MagneGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit MagneGrip.com.